So we come to our final segment of Kakar's excerpt on sexuality, which is the segment on alternate sexuality. So how is alternate sexuality viewed in the context of India? Now, homosexuality as an act does exist. There is in no way disregard of that. But identifying as homosexual is a whole different thing. So, in some sense, the idea that if a man does engage in a homosexual act with another person, it's masked as musty, and musty translates into playfulness, into fun, or also similar in sound to the idea of an elephant in heat. So it is not acknowledged as an identity, it's acknowledged only as, it's just one of those things that you do. And so, in that sense, that is a defining way of how homosexuality is viewed in the Indian context. As long as you don't admit to being homosexual, you can engage in homosexual activities. And if that seems like something that makes no sense, it's a very Indian way of looking at the idea of homosexual desire itself, because you can have that provided you continue to be married, you have children, you raise a family, you do all those things that are expected of you, because those are social responsibilities. It's kind of like how, even in the Indian context, as long as you fulfill your requirements to your family, what you do on the side does not actually matter. And especially if it is with someone of the same sex, it does not matter at all. It's not even considered. It's not a conversation, because the less we acknowledge it, the better, right? So, in fact, Kakar references a certain experience, and this, in many ways, I think sums up the idea. So, he talks about Ashok Rao Kavi, a well-known gay activist, and he was trying to sort of, he was being pressured by his family to marry, and finally, he bursts out and he's like, no, I like to be with men. And his aunt very, very clearly sort of snaps back saying, and I quote, "I don't care whether you fuck crocodiles or elephants, why can't you marry?" So you realize that your sexual preference or your sexual desire has nothing to do with marriage. That is a social fulfillment. That is, making sure that your lineage continues. But what you do on the side does not matter. It's of absolutely no consequence. And again, maybe from a very romantic perspective of what a fulfilled life looks like, this sounds like a very awkward way of looking at it. Also, from a very psychological perspective of, health, you realize that this kind of duality could take such a toll on a person. But the idea being that it's fine, because the fabric of society cannot be affected. As long as you fulfill your duty, no one's going to question you. As long as you do what is expected of you as a man, get married, raise kids, do all your duties, what you do otherwise on the side does not matter. And that tells us then how we sort of view the concept of homosexuality itself. There is no acknowledgement. There is no self-acknowledgement as well. Like, you can't admit to yourself that this is something you feel, right? Because that would be completely unacceptable. So if you cannot even accept it to yourself, and if this is a desire or a part of you that you want to acknowledge, you then live with that kind of incompleteness. And actually, for that, you can actually go back to how Mishima explores it in Confessions of a Mask, because there is, in the child narrator itself, this very early realization that, oh, I can never be like this publicly. And so later on, you also have the adult speaking, saying that, which means you already realize that you can never have fulfillment in life, because you can never be true to yourself. So you can never find the true happiness you want. You will have to keep pretending, and maybe somewhere even that pretense will not work for you. So you will always live a sort of incomplete kind of a life. And that's a terrible realization, because you will neither find fulfillment in that sense, and nor can, and you still want to conform to what society wants you. And I suppose this is something you also see in Giovanni's room, right? Because he can never acknowledge to himself that this is a desire he experiences. Instead, he has to sort of explain it away. He has to sort of say that, no, this is not really a thing. I don't actually have this. And he has to sort of explore it differently to feel more confident or certain of himself, right? And so, in this sense, this homosexual denial seems to be a general problem, yes, and in the Indian context, it's particularly two-sided, because you can do it on the side, but don't open your mouth about it, right? So unless you're very openly expressive of your sexuality, people will just close their eyes. They will just look the other way and they will not acknowledge it, because the less we talk about it, the better. So unless you're very obviously expressing an alternate identity, like say someone of the Hijra community as we have it, then it cannot be explained away. So then it's either a source of mockery or it's a source of, pity. One of the two emotions come into play, right? But otherwise, you can actually peacefully get by without revealing it to people. In fact, there are different ways in which people sort of use this to bypass social criticism. Like, for instance, going back to the semen theory of how semen is so important and it gives you energy and it is the material form of the human soul. You have different men who like to be penetrated and then explain it as, oh, the semen has entered into me and that gives me more energy and makes me more masculine. Or men who perform oral sex and then again they're like, oh, so we have taken in semen, so again that makes us more spiritual and stronger and more masculine. It's a great explanation from within that context, but you realize that at the heart of it, there is no true acknowledgement of what it really is about, right? And even in ancient India, for that matter, as Kakar points out, it's the homosexual that's criticized, but the homosexual activity is still ignored. It's kind of like, yeah, we're not okay, but as long as we don't hear too much about it, like unless you very obviously come across as someone who is, like I said, very openly so, it's okay. You can skirt societal scorn, right? And so he even talks about this term called kliba. It's a catch-all term, and I quote, to include someone who is sterile, impotent, castrated, transvestite, man who had oral sex with other men, who had anal sex as a recipient, a man with mutilated or deficient sexual organs, a man who produced only female children, and finally a hermaphrodite. So it's kind of like a catch-all term, but it's actually seen with a certain kind of pity, revulsion, dismay. Those are the emotions associated with, like, oh, poor thing, what can you do? You really can't. And in fact, in the seminal book Same-Sex Love in India, Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai's book, Ruth Vanita talks about how another explanation within the Indian context for same-sex desire is that, oh, in their past life, they were cruelly separated, so even now in this life, though they are in forms that are socially unacceptable, they desire each other. So rebirth becomes like an explanation for it, and it's actually it's something that people accept. Like it's okay. We get where it's coming from. There's obviously a reason for such a relationship, because maybe normally it couldn't have happened, but yeah, I mean, this is the reason. It's a past life thing. I mean, you're carrying the burden of it into this life, and so you need to be fulfilled irrespective of whether social conventions are maintained or not, and it's sort of explained away, right? But again, it doesn't truly acknowledge homosexuality as an identity and what it means to be homosexual, right? In fact, there isn't, in that sense. He even talks about how there aren't like any strict punishments per se. It's actually probably when the British took over and colonized India, that you had, for instance, the Section 377, which was until very recently in our law, all right, but that was a punishable offense. But otherwise, they were very mild punishments that ancient moral codes are there, because you see it as a sense of like a pity, or you're just like, oh, poor thing, like what can they do, they can't help it, this is just who they are, or it's a past life thing. And so there's an explanation for it and no acknowledgement of it. But now, for instance, because of the repeal of Section 377, you have the right to privacy being upheld, and the right to consensual sex. But it's still an uphill battle in that sense, because for many people it's like, is it really a thing? Like, as long as it happens quietly and nobody finds out about it, do it. Why do you want to make a scene about it? Why do you want to talk about it? Right? But at least there is a conversation about male homosexuality. When it comes to female homosexuality or lesbianism, that doesn't even exist, because male homosexuals are like, okay, unfortunately they are around. Female homosexual, that's a thing. There's something called lesbianism. How? Where? That is something that people really don't know how to understand. So in fact, one explanation for lesbianism is, that those women, they're just unhappy in their marriage. It's really sad. In fact, when Deepa Mehta's Fire came, everyone sort of celebrated it as this controversial film. Look, it explores lesbianism, wonderful, and things like that. But it again goes back to the same idea that they turn to each other because they were in unhappy marriages. It doesn't actually acknowledge lesbianism. It acknowledges the social perspective of lesbianism, which is not the same thing. Right? And in fact, the punishments for lesbianism were worse, because especially if one of the parties is say a virgin, so you're punished for deflowering her, so that's seen as a really bad thing. And for that, the punishment was really severe. In fact, he talks about a woman who corrupts a virgin is to be punished by having 2 of her fingers cut off, because she's robbing the woman of her chastity, and that's a heinous act. So you realize that female homosexuality was more punished because it was more of concern for women's virginity and purity rather than anything else, to like basically control the female body than anything else. But there is, in that sense, no true acknowledgement. But in all of this, what we sort of realize is that there is a perspective of Indian sexuality where the erotic is sort of tolerated, the aesthetic is also sort of tolerated, because there is a lot of there's a lot of humor also associated, like, oh my god, like, sure, you can stay celibate kind of an attitude. So there is that as well. We are just constantly trying to find a balance between these spaces, and that's really what Kakar's chapter on sexuality really talks about. The idea that we're always in a space of trying to find a middle ground where we can sort of function as individuals, function as people who can sort of explore. Of course, not openly, because that conversation is not happening. Things are changing, but it's still not the same. Like, there is still a lot that goes unacknowledged and unexpressed, and especially certain identities continue to stay buried because it's just easier and convenient. But it is, in that sense, quite a revelatory explanation of the duality of what it means to be Indian, especially within a sexual sphere.